Hi everyone, in this video we will see a few hacks about pinning fabrics in sewing. What happens very often when starting sewing is that instinctively we start pinning on one side of the fabrics and pin along the line we want to sew to the other side. And doing it that way presents a few issues. The first issue with pinning that way is that it creates a kind of undulation in the seam, so you don't have something that's flat. The second issue is that if one of the fabrics you're using is stretchier than the other, it's very easy to, like while you pin, pull a bit more on one side, and then at the end of the pinning you might have some extra fabric on one of the pieces, and compared to the other, even though you have like the same size on both sides. And it also can create like a pull on the stretchier fabric because it has been like pushed too much compared to the other. With very tiny pieces you don't notice it that much, but you can still see that the stretchier one is a bit bigger, even though when we started pinning they were exactly the same size. And if you are doing like a longer seam, that's like a side seam for example, or a seam in a dress or curtains or something that's longer, then you might end up with a few centimeters or like half an inch or an inch extra fabric on one side, which can mess your patterns. And finally, if you pin this way, you have to sew over all the pins. So it's trickier because they can get stuck in your machine, and also if you miss one, then your machine will stitch over the whole pin, and there's a high risk of breaking your needle on your machine. And also if you're sewing by hand, it's easier to also like pin your hand while sewing. The main hack when pinning fabrics together is to start at the ends. So first you pin the ends together, then the middle, and then the middle of each section. And that way you add pins regularly and you don't push one of the fabrics more on the side than the other. And the second hack is that we pin in in a right angle to the seam we want to make. So the pins are perpendicular to the seam you want to make. Also, when pinning, it's important to keep the pin perpendicular and then hold the fabrics in place when you twist the pin to pass it through the fabrics again. That way the fabrics don't move and you can pinpoint the right spot on the line on both fabrics on both sides, and it doesn't move when you secure the pin in the fabrics. And that way you get something that's flatter, and if when sewing with your machine you accidentally miss one pin, there is less risk of breaking the needle of your machine. Here you can see that even with a stretchy fabric, the edges are nicely together and the stretchier fabric hasn't moved. Let's see now how this works if you work on a project with very specific marks that need to be pinned together. So here it's a very simple patchwork seam with squares, but we want the angles pinned together. Here we will pin through the spot that indicates the angle, and then check the other side that we are hitting the same mark, and then you secure your pin and hold your fabrics together. Then we do the same on the other side, and here you can see that it hit the spot on the yellow side but not on the brown side. So in this case, we don't need to remove the pin completely, just from the side where it didn't pin the right spot we wanted. And then once you have both sides on the right mark, then you kind of shift the fabrics between your fingers to get the needle perpendicular to the fabrics, and then you secure it. And in a project like this, where we have a very specific spot, so here it's the middle seam that we want to get right, then you secure that spot first and then go for the middle of each section. And now let's try what happens if we don't hold the fabrics well when securing the pin. Let's see if the lines moved a bit. Okay, so here they didn't move that much, so we don't really see a difference because the fabrics are very thin. But let's try with a thicker fabric just to see what happens if we are careless when pinning. So this fabric is much thicker, and let's try and pin it together. So following the same rules, some of the rules we saw earlier. So pinning by putting the pin in perpendicular and pinning in a right angle to the seam we want to sew. But let's try to be a bit careless and not hold the fabrics in place properly when securing the pin. And you will see that it kind of shifts the lines a bit and you get a tiny gap. Let's see the middle. And here you can see that we already have a very tiny gap between the lines. And if we pinpoint the line on one side, you can see that we're not hitting the line on the other side. It's not a huge difference, but the thing is that in sewing, the mistakes we make in an early stage kind of grow over time, because there's always a tiny margin of error at every step. And when you're sewing something, you might have 10, 15, 20 steps. And then if you make like a 1 millimeter error in the first step and each step afterwards, then you might end up with one side of a fabric that's like half an inch or 2 centimeters too long compared to the other, and then you can't fix it anymore. So being very precise, or as precise as possible at every step, is what makes the work afterwards easier, because you have less issues coming, and also the end result looks nicer. And in some techniques like patchwork, for example, where you have a lot of seams and you have to be very precise, you can very easily spot if like there's even like a very tiny difference between two sides. You can easily see the difference. Here you can notice that with only 5 pins, we are holding both sides of the fabric together, and each strategic point, so the angles and the middle, are held together in a way that they won't move when sewing, and also that the place where we want to sew is very flat, so it will be easier to sew with the machine. Now let's see what happens when we want to pin different shapes. So here we have a straight shape and a round shape. This is a very common situation in sewing. For example, if you're sewing clothes, when sewing a sleeve, because you have the sleeve that's round and the armhole that's much flatter or round in the other way. In this situation, we have the same marks at the ends, and then there's a tiny dent in the middle of each fabric that is the middle. So those two dents need to go together. So we start with the ends. And here you can notice that there is a tiny gap in the end, like a tiny V that appears. That tiny V is the depth of your seam value. So if your seam value is 1 centimeter, you can measure that it's 1 centimeter. And if it's smaller, then it needs to be smaller. If it's 2 centimeters, then it needs to be a bit bigger. Basically, when you sew and you open the seam, you want the raw edges of the fabrics to be exactly at the same spot where the seam ends. And that way, when your seam is done and you open, you get like a perfect edge to your sewing. And once you've done pinning the ends, we will start by pinning the middle. So here we look for the tiny dents that mark the center of each piece and pin those together. And then we will pin the middle of each section. So you can see it doesn't fall flat. You have one fabric, the lighter fabric, that falls lower. You find the center of that section and then pull lightly on the fabric that's too low to bring it edge to edge with the other, and then pin together. Here you can notice that the raw edges are already falling closer on the smaller sections. Then we do the same with the other side. So spot the center and then bring the fabric edge to edge with the other and pin. And then we do the same with each tinier section, and you can see that it's already easier to do. So now that it's done, you can see that we have some extra fabric on the lower part, but the part that we want to sew is flat enough to get a nice seam and not get like tiny folds everywhere. And on the other side also, you get a flattened area that is easy to sew. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section.